The heavy brass key felt unnaturally cold in my palm as I stood before the front door of the penthouse I had paid for with my own inheritance, only to find my biometric access denied. A digital screen flashed a mocking red pulse, while the muffled sound of my husband's laughter, intertwined with his mother's sharp, triumphant voice, drifted through the reinforced mahogany. 10 minutes later, I was sitting on the hallway floor in my designer heels, holding a legal notice taped to the door that claimed I had abandoned the property. A property that had been in my family's name for 3 generations, not his. They hadn't just changed the locks, they had successfully erased my existence from the home I was currently pregnant in, and they expected me to simply disappear into the rain. Life had been a seamless tapestry of quiet perfection just 6 months ago. I remember the smell of fresh eucalyptus that always greeted me in the entryway, the soft hum of the high-end espresso machine as Mark prepared our morning lattes, and the way the morning light caught the dust motes dancing over the grand piano in the living room. Everything was curated, polished, and safe. My husband, Mark, was the quintessential architect, precise, soft-spoken, and seemingly devoted to our future. We were renovating this apartment together, picking out marble countertops and hand-woven rugs, building a sanctuary for the baby we were finally expecting. His mother, Eleanor, was the only snag in the silk. She was a woman who moved through life like an invading army, always impeccably dressed in charcoal suits, her eyes constantly scanning for imperfections. At first, I viewed her as merely an overbearing relic of a different generation. She would visit twice a week, ostensibly to check on the construction progress, but I always felt like an intruder in my own home whenever she entered the room. She had a way of pointing at a piece of heirloom furniture and asking, with a thin, condescending smile, if I felt it was truly appropriate for a space of such prestige. I used to laugh it off, squeezed her hand, and told her that Mark and I loved the history behind every piece. I was naive. I believed that my kindness and my financial independence, the wealth my late father had left me, made me untouchable. I thought that by sharing my resources, I was building a stronger foundation for our marriage. I didn't see the way Eleanor looked at the property deeds when she thought I wasn't looking, nor did I pay enough attention to the way Mark's hands would tremble slightly whenever she brought up the topic of asset management. The money for the renovation came entirely from my account, a fact I took pride in. I wanted our home to be a testament to my hard work and the legacy my father had left behind. Every invoice I paid, every contractor I hired, I kept meticulous records. I had a small velvet-lined box in the study where I kept the physical copies of the deeds and the original lease agreement, the document that proved I was the sole proprietor of the estate until the trust fully vested. I loved the silence of that house. It felt like a fortress against the rest of the world. Even when Mark began staying late at the office, citing massive firm deadlines, I filled the evenings with soft jazz and the anticipation of our child. I often found myself talking to my stomach, telling the baby about the piano, the high ceilings, and the life we were going to build. The only shadow was Eleanor's increasing presence. She had started bringing advisors over, men in gray suits who would pace around the perimeter of the living room, whispering into their phones. When I asked what was happening, Mark would simply kiss my forehead, his skin feeling clammy against mine, and tell me not to worry about the logistics, that Eleanor was just helping him organize the estate taxes. "It's just a mountain of paperwork, darling," he would murmur, his eyes darting toward the door where his mother waited. "You're the heart of this house. Let us handle the brain." I trusted him. I let them handle the brain, never realizing that while I was busy decorating the nursery, they were busy rewriting the laws of our life. I didn't notice the subtle shift in the tone of the household, the way the staff began to look at me with pity rather than deference, or the way the mail started arriving addressed to the estate of Eleanor rather than to me. I was the princess in the tower, and I was so blinded by the view that I didn't notice the foundation being chipped away, stone by stone, right beneath my feet. The house felt warm and full of life, but in the walls, the termites were already gorging themselves on my future. The cracks in the foundation began as hairline fractures, almost invisible, easily dismissed by someone who wanted to believe in a fairy tale. It started with the disappearing documents. I remember reaching for the velvet-lined box in the study, intending to pull out the original lease agreement to show my interior designer, only to find the box empty. My heart skipped a beat. a sharp, cold prick of anxiety that I immediately shoved aside. I assumed Mark had moved it to the wall safe for added security, given the high cost of the renovations. When I asked him about it over dinner, he didn't even look up from his steak. He just shrugged, his expression unnervingly blank, and said that he'd had his mother's assistant move some things around to streamline our insurance filings. Then came the calls. My phone began to buzz at odd hours, 3 or 4 in the morning. When I answered, there was only the sound of heavy, rhythmic breathing before the line clicked dead. I brushed it off as a faulty network or a wrong number, though a sinking feeling took root in my stomach. Eleanor became a fixture in the house, moving with a proprietary air that made my skin crawl. She would rearrange the books on my shelves, removing titles she deemed unsuitable, and replace them with dense, leather-bound legal tomes that looked like they belonged in a courtroom. She no longer spoke to me. She spoke at me, her voice a low, steady drone about the inevitability of structural change. Mark's behavior shifted from neglectful to avoidant. He started wearing his watch in the shower, and I noticed he had replaced his phone with a newer model that was always face down on the nightstand. His affection, once warm and spontaneous, became performative. A quick peck on the cheek, a distracted touch on my shoulder. It was as if he were mourning me while I was still standing right in front of him. The final warning sign came in the form of a formal letter delivered by a courier addressed to the tenant. It was an eviction notice for an apartment I owned. I laughed out loud, thinking it was a clerical error, a joke gone wrong. But when I went to confront Mark, he wasn't in his study. He was in the garden, standing under the weeping willow, his back to me, engaged in a hushed, intense conversation with Eleanor. The point of no return arrived on a Tuesday, a day of suffocating humidity and gray, oppressive clouds. Mark had left for a business dinner that felt like a flimsy excuse, and the house felt cavernous. Driven by an inexplicable, frantic need to understand, I walked into his study, a room he had forbidden me from entering recently, citing client confidentiality. I didn't care. I needed to see if the files were there. I didn't find the files. I found something far worse. His laptop was sitting on the desk, still logged into his private cloud account. Curiosity, sharp and jagged, forced my hand. I clicked on a folder labeled Reallocation. My breath hitched as the screen filled with scanned documents. Not insurance papers, but legal transfers. My name had been systematically stripped from the deeds of our home, the investment properties, and even my personal bank accounts. It had been replaced by a shell company owned by Eleanor. My stomach lurched violently, and a wave of nausea washed over me so powerful I had to grab the edge of the mahogany desk to keep from collapsing. Then I saw the emails. A thread between Mark and a divorce attorney dated back 3 months. He wasn't just managing assets, he was liquidating my life. The final attachment was a medical evaluation of my mental stability, signed by a doctor I had never met, suggesting that due to my pregnancy-related stress, I was unfit to manage my own finances. My vision blurred, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The air in the room grew thin and metallic, tasting like copper in panic. My hands, cold as ice, trembled so violently that I couldn't even click the mouse to close the window. The sound of my own pulse roared in my ears, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that sounded like a war march. I wasn't just losing a house, I was being erased. I realized then that my husband hadn't just stopped loving me, he was actively hunting me, using his own mother as the blade, and I was holding the pregnancy that he planned to use as the ultimate weapon to take everything. My legs finally gave out, and I sank to the floor, the cold hardwood biting into my skin as the realization solidified. I was a stranger in my own life, and the people I trusted most were the ones pulling the trigger. The physical reaction was like a slow-motion drowning. I sat on the floor of that mahogany-paneled office for what felt like hours, the blue light of the laptop screen illuminating the room in a ghostly, clinical glow. Every time I looked at the signatures on the fraudulent transfers, my own name forged with terrifying precision, a new wave of bile rose in my throat. I wasn't just betrayed. I was being dismantled. I stood up, my knees shaking so hard I had to lean against the wall for support. I didn't cry. The shock had frozen my tear ducts shut, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity that felt like swallowing shards of glass. I had just enough time to snap photos of every screen, every attachment, and every email thread before I heard the front door open downstairs. "Mark?" I called out, my voice sounding hollow and alien in the vast space of the hallway. He didn't answer immediately. I heard the murmur of voices, his and Eleanor's, and the familiar click-clack of her heels on the marble. I didn't wait for them to come to me. I walked out of the study, my feet moving with a strange, detached purpose. I met them at the top of the grand staircase. Mark stopped dead, his face draining of color. Eleanor, draped in a cream-colored cashmere coat, looked up at me, her eyes narrowing into slits. She didn't look guilty. She looked annoyed, as if I were a houseguest who had overstayed her welcome. "What are you doing in the study?" Mark asked, his voice cracking. He tried to project authority, but his eyes darted toward the hallway, looking for an exit strategy. "I think the better question, Mark," I said, my voice eerily calm, "is what you and your mother have been doing with my life for the last 6 months." Eleanor let out a sharp, dismissive huff and began peeling off her gloves. "Oh, stop the histrionics. You've been unstable, and we've been protecting the family interests. You should be thanking us for taking the burden off your shoulders during your pregnancy." "Protecting the family interests?" I laughed, a jagged, mirthless sound that seemed to echo off the high ceilings. I pulled my phone from my pocket and held it up. "Is that what you call forging my signature on the deed to this house? Is that what you call hiring a fake psychiatrist to declare me incompetent? You didn't protect anything, Eleanor. You laundered my inheritance through a shell company to make sure that when you kicked me out, I'd be destitute." Mark took a step toward me, reaching out as if to touch my arm. "Honey, listen. You don't understand the legal complexities. It was just a temporary measure. We were going to explain it when things settled down." "Don't touch me!" I snapped, the volume of my voice making him flinch. "I read the emails, Mark. I saw the plan to serve me with papers as soon as the baby is born. You were going to take the house, the accounts, and then argue for full custody because I was unfit. Did you really think I'd just roll over?" Eleanor stepped forward, her face a mask of cold fury. "You have nothing. You are a guest in this house, and the new lease agreement, which you clearly haven't bothered to read, states that the primary occupant must be a legal representative of the holding company, which, as of this morning, is me." She gestured to the front door, where I saw a man in a dark suit standing, a private security guard she had brought with her. "You have 1 hour to pack a bag. Mark has already signed the papers for the dissolution of the marriage, and you will find that your credit cards have been deactivated. We've been very generous in letting you stay this long." I looked at Mark, waiting for him to speak. He stood there, his shoulders hunched, staring at the floor. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. He just murmured, "It's for the best, Elena. You're not thinking clearly." I felt the first spark of real, hot rage ignite in my chest, burning away the shock. "You think you've won because you have the keys and the lawyers," I said, walking down the stairs toward them, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But you made one mistake, Eleanor. You underestimated how much I learned about contracts from the man who raised me. And Mark? You underestimated the fact that I never stopped being the one who owned the roof over your head." As I walked past them toward the kitchen to grab my emergency bag, Eleanor scoffed. "You own nothing. The courts will see you as a hysterical, pregnant woman with a history of mental instability. You are going to leave here with the clothes on your back and nothing more." "Check your email, Eleanor," I said, not looking back. "I just sent the original, notarized power of attorney to your firm's senior partners and the State Ethics Board. The one that hasn't been tampered with. The one that grants me, and only me, the right to dissolve any shell company you've ever touched." The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time, I saw genuine fear flicker in Eleanor's eyes. Mark looked up, his mouth hanging open, his face pale as a sheet. The shift in power was palpable, a heavy weight that suddenly leaned in my direction. They thought they had trapped me in a cage, but they hadn't realized that I was the one who held the key to the entire building. The silence in the grand foyer felt like a vacuum. Eleanor's face, usually a masterpiece of composed disdain, twitched. She tapped her phone screen with frantic, trembling fingers, her earlier poise dissolving into the sharp, jerky movements of a cornered predator. Mark had drifted back toward the study, presumably to check the server or alert his lawyers, his face a mosaic of growing panic. "You're lying," Eleanor hissed, though the conviction in her voice was fraying at the edges. "You don't have access to the ethics board. Those files were wiped. I paid 3 separate tech consultants to scrub the cloud history." I stopped at the threshold of the kitchen and turned to look at her, savoring the way the light caught the genuine terror in her eyes. "You paid the wrong people, Eleanor. You're an architect of structures, not software. Did you really think I'd let the only record of my father's legacy exist solely on a server you controlled? I have a mirrored backup in a physical vault in the city, and it's been set to auto-forward to a federal prosecutor the moment it detected an unauthorized change in ownership. It triggered the moment you swapped the deed this morning." I watched as the realization hit her. The secondary twist, the one she hadn't accounted for, wasn't just the existence of the documents. It was the fact that I had known about her scheming for weeks. I hadn't been an oblivious, pregnant housewife. I had been bait. Every invoice she stole, every email she wiped, I had been documenting as part of a grand larceny case. "Mark!" she shrieked, spinning around to face her son. "Do something! Get her phone!" Mark stepped forward, his expression hardening into something ugly and desperate. He wasn't the man I fell in love with. He was a coward stripped of his mask. "Give me the phone, Elena. You're making a scene, and this is only going to make it worse for you. I'll make sure you have a place to stay, but you have to hand over the data. Now." He lunged for my wrist, but I sidestepped with a grace fueled by adrenaline. I didn't run. I stood my ground. "Touch me, Mark, and the next thing you hear will be the sirens. I've already contacted the private security firm that manages the estate's external perimeter. They've been recording the audio of this conversation for the past 10 minutes. You're currently in the middle of attempted extortion, forgery, and domestic battery." The third twist struck them like a physical blow. The security guard she had brought to evict me didn't move. He stood by the door, his hand resting on his radio, looking at Eleanor with a completely neutral, professional expression. "Ma'am," the guard said, his voice deep and steady, "I was hired by the primary property owner to oversee the security of these premises. My instructions are to protect the rights of the leaseholder. If you or the gentleman attempt to use physical force, I am authorized to detain you until the authorities arrive." Eleanor's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. She looked at the guard, then at me, then at the staircase, as if expecting an escape route to appear. You paid him?" "I didn't have to," I replied, my voice cold and lethal. "I pay the property taxes. I pay the insurance. I pay the staff. You were just a guest who got greedy, and now you're a trespasser." Mark looked around the room, his eyes wild. He realized that the very infrastructure they had used to isolate me, the exclusive security, the legal barriers, the high-end management, had all been paid for with my money, which meant I had the right to revoke access for anyone I deemed a threat. "You can't do this," Mark whimpered, his voice cracking. "We're married. We're a family." "You lost the right to that word the moment you signed that medical evaluation," I said, my voice cutting through his pathetic attempt at manipulation. "You tried to declare me insane so you could steal my child's future. You aren't my family. You're a liability." I pulled out my phone and dialed the number I had saved days ago. I turned on the speakerphone so they could hear every word. "Officer, yes, I have the individuals who forged the transfer of my property on the premises. I have evidence of multiple counts of fraud and attempted extortion. I would like them removed from my home immediately." As I spoke, I watched their world implode. Eleanor sank onto the velvet bench in the hallway, her face white, looking at her expensive handbag as if it were a life raft that had just deflated. Mark was pacing in circles, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, still trying to formulate a defense that didn't exist. The house, once a warm, inviting sanctuary, had turned into a cold, clinical trap for them, and for the first time in my life, I felt the terrifying, exhilarating power of being completely in control. The transformation was complete. I was no longer the victim of their greed. I was the architect of their ruin. The transformation didn't happen in a single moment of rage. It happened in the cold, precise silence that followed the arrival of the police. As the officers swept through the house, collecting the evidence I had laid out on the kitchen island, I watched Mark and Eleanor through the floor-to-ceiling windows. They were no longer the masterminds of my life. They were two desperate, sweating individuals being led out in handcuffs, their faces twisted in a mixture of disbelief and frantic blame-shifting. When they were finally gone, the house felt heavy, not with the suffocating presence of their schemes, but with the silence of a space being reclaimed. I didn't stay to watch them drive away. I went to the study, opened the floor safe, and placed the genuine, notarized documents back inside. My hand didn't tremble. I was no longer the girl who needed a partner to manage her legacy. I was the guardian of it. The months that followed were a blur of legal maneuvers and necessary destruction. The shell companies Eleanor had constructed were dismantled by federal investigators, their assets frozen and subjected to forensic audits. It turned out that her advisors were involved in a wider web of white-collar crime, and once the authorities had a thread to pull, the entire tapestry unraveled. Mark tried to plead insanity, claiming he had been coerced by his mother, but the digital trail, the emails, the forged medical records, the prearranged divorce papers, painted a clear picture of calculated, predatory intent. He was barred from any contact with me, and the court granted me full control over my assets, with a permanent restraining order against both of them. Retribution wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a long, systematic reclaiming. I didn't find joy in their poverty, but I found immense satisfaction in their insignificance. Without my resources, their social standing evaporated overnight. The firm Mark worked for fired him publicly, citing ethical violations, and Eleanor's reputation in the social circles she so desperately clung to became a cautionary tale. They had wanted to strip me of everything, but instead, they had stripped themselves of the only life they understood. 6 months later, the house was unrecognizable, yet exactly as it should have been. I had replaced the heavy, impersonal furniture Eleanor had forced upon me with things that felt like home. Warm colors, soft textiles, and objects that held memories of my father. The eucalyptus smell was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh peonies and the faint, sweet aroma of the tea I drank on the balcony. I sat on the terrace as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. My baby, little Leo, was sleeping peacefully in the nursery upstairs. My house, my child, my future. The legal battles were behind me, settled by ink and judgment. I looked at the brass key resting on the table next to my book. I didn't need it to prove my ownership anymore. I felt it in my bones. The fear that had once paralyzed me had been replaced by a quiet, unbreakable confidence. I had been tested, stripped down to my core, and in the process, I had discovered that I wasn't the fragile ornament they thought I was. I was the foundation. I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the cool evening breeze against my face. The house was quiet, but it was no longer a silent trap. It was a sanctuary, and for the first time in my life, I was its sole, undisputed mistress. I realized then that betrayal had been the most expensive lesson I ever paid for, but it had bought me the only thing that truly mattered, the absolute, unwavering knowledge that I could survive anything, provided I never gave anyone else the power to define my worth. I stood up, walked to the railing, and breathed in the night air, knowing that tomorrow would be exactly what I chose to make of it.